Pete Hoekstra had a rough day on Canadian television yesterday. He stumbled through questions. He hedged where he used to be blunt. He looked nothing like the confident ambassador who has spent months talking tough on behalf of Washington. Clips of the awkward pauses are already circulating, and plenty of viewers are framing this as a simple story about one man having a bad day in front of the cameras. But if you only watched the discomfort, you missed what actually happened here. Pete Hoekstra is not a free agent making his own case in Ottawa. He is the United States ambassador to Canada, which means he is Donald Trump's representative, full stop. His job has never been to share his personal opinions on trade policy. His job is to defend whatever Washington decides, explain it in terms Canadians will accept, and sell it on live television. That means every single answer he gave yesterday was not just one man's perspective. It was a direct window into how the Trump administration is currently approaching its negotiations with Canada. So when his tone shifts as dramatically as it did, the real question is not what's wrong with Hoekstra. The real question is what's wrong with the strategy he's being asked to sell. For months, that strategy was straightforward and consistent. Apply pressure, make threats, shift deadlines, generate headlines, keep Canada off balance and guessing about what comes next. Hoekstra played his role well throughout. He criticized Ottawa's response to the trade dispute. He spoke as though the United States held every piece of leverage in the relationship. He projected total confidence, week after week, interview after interview. Then, almost overnight, that swagger disappeared. Suddenly he's telling Canadian audiences there's no deal close at hand. He's saying, in his own words, that things are not on track compared to where talks stand with Mexico. According to political commentator Tom Mulcair, that kind of shift in tone is not a slip of the tongue or a bad day at the office. It's an admission, even if an unintentional one, that the original plan is not working the way Washington hoped it would. Mulcair frames this as exactly what should have been expected from the start. Trump has his spokesperson in Ottawa, and that spokesperson plays the game the way Trump calls it. Mulcair points to the recent controversy around an advertisement that ran during the World Series, the one referencing Ronald Reagan's actual past comments warning against the use of tariffs because consumers ultimately pay the price for them. The Americans seized on the ad as an excuse to claim outrage, even bringing in the Ronald Reagan Foundation to push back on it as supposedly fake. According to Mulcair, the content wasn't fabricated at all. It was word for word something Reagan had actually said. But the outrage gave Washington another talking point, another reason to claim it had been wronged, another card to play in a negotiation built almost entirely around manufactured grievances and constant pressure. Here's why that pressure-based approach matters so much to understanding what happened on screen yesterday. Washington's entire playbook in trade negotiations like this one depends on the other side losing its nerve first. Create enough uncertainty, generate enough alarming headlines, and eventually the other party rushes to the table looking for relief, ready to concede just to make the pressure stop. That's the theory, anyway. It's worked for the Trump administration in plenty of other contexts over the years, except this time, Canada simply didn't play along. Instead of panicking or rushing into concessions, Mark Carney's government has remained remarkably calm throughout this entire stretch of the negotiation. Carney kept signing trade agreements with other countries, refusing to make the relationship with Washington the only game in town. Dominic LeBlanc kept negotiating steadily behind the scenes, term by term, without taking the bait on every dramatic statement coming out of the U.S. side. Trade officials kept doing the slow, unglamorous work of actually moving talks forward instead of reacting to whatever headline Washington produced that week. Mulcair gives real credit here, specifically singling out LeBlanc's patience as something worth admiring, even joking that he deserves a medal for his forbearance. He notes that LeBlanc is well trained for this kind of fight, having completed a Master's of Law at a top American university, which gives him a genuine read on how the American side thinks and negotiates. That background, paired with his evident patience, has let him absorb pressure without escalating it. Carney, meanwhile, has taken a similarly tempered approach, even as the media keeps pushing him to engage with the spectacle Trump thrives on. Mulcair points out that wherever Carney travels, whether to a G7 meeting or elsewhere, journalists keep asking the same question in different forms. Has he spoken to Trump yet? Is a meeting being scheduled? What's the latest on the relationship? Mulcair describes this as Trump's constant hunger for media attention and notes that Carney has been trying to somewhat starve that hunger through his own measured, low-drama posture instead of feeding it. What makes this particularly notable, according to Mulcair, is that Carney brings decades of experience dealing with difficult, blustery political figures on the international stage. He acknowledges there's never been a phenomenon quite like Trump before. But Carney has had plenty of practice managing big personalities and big egos in global finance and politics over the years, and that experience is clearly shaping his approach now. There's also a regional dimension to this that Washington may not have fully anticipated. Mulcair highlights that Canada and Mexico have been coordinating directly, publicly describing themselves as being in lockstep and committed to working together rather than letting the United States play one off against the other. He calls this a classic and expected negotiating tactic from the Trump administration, the strategy of trying to isolate each trading partner and extract separate concessions. The fact that Canada and Mexico are resisting that playbook together appears to be complicating Washington's approach in ways that weren't part of the original plan. So if the usual pressure tactics aren't generating the panic Washington was counting on, what comes next? Mulcair offers a specific prediction here, and it's worth paying close attention to. He notes that July 1st is not actually a drop-dead deadline for the broader trade agreement. The deal itself continues for 10 years regardless of that date, since July 1st simply marks a renewal point built into the structure of the agreement. But there is a separate clause that allows any party to give 6 months' notice of withdrawal at any time. Mulcair predicts that invoking this withdrawal clause is likely the next dramatic move from Washington, a way to manufacture another crisis and another news cycle, even though the underlying deal isn't actually at risk of collapsing. He frames this prediction around the personalities involved. He describes Trump and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick as two billionaires out of New York who share a particular style, full of bluster, full of charm in equal measure, and committed to pushing and pushing until they get something they can call a win. Hoekstra, in Mulcair's framing, is simply their mouthpiece on the ground in Canada, delivering whatever version of the message they've decided on that week. And that brings up what Mulcair considers the single most important word to listen for going forward: win. He points to how Trump handled the recent situation involving Iran as a useful example of this pattern. Trump publicly described the outcome there as a total victory, even though, as Mulcair notes, Iran still controls the Strait of Hormuz, is still set to receive a substantial reparations payment, and still holds onto its uranium stockpile with only vague commitments about diluting it. Despite all of that, Trump framed it as a decisive win for himself. Mulcair suggests that this same instinct will shape how Trump and Lutnick approach the endgame on a Canada deal. If Trump can't construct a version of events where he gets to claim a clear personal victory, he may simply delay finalizing anything rather than sign an agreement he can't boast about publicly. That single word, Mulcair argues, may end up being the real signal to watch for in Hoekstra's future comments. More than any specific deadline or threat, none of this means Mulcair expects negotiations to collapse. Quite the opposite. He states plainly that there's no real danger of a Canada-US-Mexico trade deal failing to materialize eventually, because it remains firmly in the United States' own economic interest to have that agreement in place. Even Trump himself has shown the contradiction in his own public statements, reportedly saying within the same breath at a G7 event that he could walk away from the deal entirely or sign it tomorrow. That kind of whiplash, according to Mulcair, is simply part of the style now. Drama isn't necessarily a sign that talks are falling apart. It's become a calculated part of how this administration manages nearly every negotiation it touches, a way of generating leverage and headlines simultaneously, whether or not either is strictly necessary at that moment. So, where does that leave things after yesterday's uncomfortable interview? It leaves us with a much clearer picture of what's actually happening behind the scenes than the surface-level discomfort suggested. Pete Hoekstra wasn't simply having a bad day. He was attempting to defend a strategy that depended on Canada folding under pressure, and Canada didn't fold. Carney didn't rush to the negotiating table out of anxiety. LeBlanc didn't escalate every time Washington raised the temperature. The government continued working steadily, building relationships elsewhere, and refusing to let any single headline dictate national policy. That patience appears to be forcing a different conversation inside the White House than the one Washington originally expected to have. The administration built its approach around the assumption that constant pressure would eventually produce a breakthrough, and so far, that hasn't happened the way it was supposed to. Hoekstra's noticeably more cautious, more defensive answers yesterday reflect that gap between expectation and reality. Expect more drama before this is resolved. Expect more shifting deadlines, more dramatic statements, and possibly that 6-month withdrawal clause getting invoked just to manufacture another sense of urgency. None of that should be mistaken for a deal actually falling apart. According to Mulcair's read of the situation, a final agreement remains the likely outcome precisely because it serves both countries' interests, even if the road there continues to be loud, theatrical, and occasionally uncomfortable to watch on live television. What yesterday's interview really revealed wasn't a single ambassador struggling with tough questions. It was a pressure-based negotiating strategy struggling against a country that simply refused to give Washington the reaction it was counting on. Canada stayed calm. Canada stayed patient. And whether that patience ultimately delivers the kind of deal both countries actually need remains to be seen. But the shape of this negotiation is clearly shifting in ways worth watching closely as it continues to unfold in the weeks ahead.